They found the bodies smiling. Deep beneath the permafrost, a disturbing reality shattered everything we knew about human history. For decades, these hidden historical mysteries confused scientists, defying logic and whispering terrifying truths. Forget what you were taught. The past isn't dead. It's waiting in the dark. Dare to look inside? The Euphrates River moves slowly through the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, carrying with it thousands of years of memory. Its waters pass ruined temples, abandoned fortresses, and cities long reduced to dust beneath the desert wind. At night, the river becomes almost unnaturally still. The air cools. Reeds sway in silence. And in the distance, beyond the shifting fog and blackened marshes, strange lights have been reported for centuries. Among the more obscure accounts preserved from the Roman frontier are references to what some historians now call the living fire of the Euphrates. Roman soldiers stationed along the empire's eastern borders described luminous flames appearing near the riverbanks without any visible source of fuel. According to fragmented writings attributed to military observers and later chroniclers, the fire moved unpredictably. It hovered low over the ground. Sometimes it appeared blue or pale green against the darkness. Other reports claimed the flames made no sound at all. To Roman eyes, this was more than a curiosity. The eastern frontier was already viewed as a land of mystery, a region where older civilizations had risen and vanished long before Rome itself existed. Strange religions flourished there. Astrologers mapped the heavens from towering ziggurats. Traders carried stories from Persia, Arabia, and beyond. In such an atmosphere, unusual natural phenomena were rarely dismissed as simple accidents. Some Roman writers believed the fire emerged from cracks in the earth. This explanation was not entirely unreasonable. The Euphrates region sits above areas rich in natural gas and bitumen deposits. Ancient peoples throughout Mesopotamia were familiar with burning springs and eternal flames caused by underground gases escaping through fissures in the rock. Greek historians had recorded similar phenomena centuries earlier. Modern researchers often point to these geological conditions as the most likely explanation. Methane or petroleum gases could ignite naturally under the right circumstances, especially during periods of seismic activity. In marshlands filled with decaying organic matter, another phenomenon can occur. Faint lights known in folklore as ghost fires or will-o'-the-wisps. Caused by the combustion of gases like phosphine, these lights can appear to drift silently above wetlands at night. And yet, some details in the Roman descriptions remain difficult to explain completely. Several reports mention the flames reacting to human presence. Soldiers claimed the lights retreated when approached, only to reappear farther away moments later. One account described a fire dividing into multiple smaller lights before vanishing entirely. Another referred to local villagers refusing to travel near certain stretches of the river after sunset, believing the lights were connected to spirits guarding ancient ruins beneath the sands. Could fear and exhaustion have distorted what the witnesses believed they saw? Life on the Roman frontier was harsh and uncertain. Soldiers endured isolation, illness, and constant tension along contested territories. Hallucinations, exaggerated rumors, and superstition were common in remote outposts. Historians caution that many surviving texts were copied repeatedly over centuries, leaving room for embellishment and myth. Still, alternative theories continue to emerge. Some fringe researchers have speculated that the living fire may have been an early encounter with rare atmospheric plasma phenomena, electrical formations not fully understood even today. Others connect the reports to legends from older Mesopotamian traditions describing divine lights associated with forgotten gods of the underworld and desert. There are even theories suggesting the Romans unknowingly witnessed remnants of ancient industrial activity near buried settlements, chemical reactions caused by long-forgotten materials beneath the earth. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of advanced bitumen use in Mesopotamian engineering, including waterproofing systems, ceremonial fires, and primitive chemical processing techniques. Could some hidden source have continued burning beneath the surface for generations? Or was the mystery shaped by something less tangible, something born from the atmosphere of the Euphrates itself? Because this river has always carried more than water. It carried armies, myths, religions, and memories from civilizations stretching back to the earliest chapters of recorded history. Along its banks, reality and legend often seem to overlap. Today, parts of the region remain difficult to study thoroughly due to conflict, environmental change, and the loss of archaeological sites. Some ancient locations described in Roman records may now lie buried beneath layers of sediment or submerged entirely, and so the question remains. If the strange fires near the Euphrates revealed how little the ancient world understood the forces beneath the earth, then the ruins of Palmyra present a different kind of mystery altogether, one hidden not in light, but in sound. Rising from the Syrian desert like the remains of a forgotten mirage, the ancient city of Palmyra was once among the wealthiest trading centers of the Roman East. Massive colonnades stretched across the sands. Temples dedicated to ancient gods stood beneath a blazing sun. Caravans carrying silk, spices, and precious metals passed through its gates for centuries, linking Rome to Persia and beyond. But beneath the visible ruins lies another world. Over the past century, archaeologists and survey teams working around Palmyra documented reports of unusual underground chambers hidden beneath sections of the ancient city. Some were discovered accidentally through collapsed stone floors or narrow openings concealed beneath debris. Others appeared only through seismic scans and incomplete subterranean mapping. What drew particular attention, however, was not simply the existence of these chambers, but their strange acoustic properties. Several explorers described entering narrow underground corridors where even the smallest sound behaved unnaturally. Footsteps echoed for far longer than expected. Whispers carried across impossible distances. In certain chambers, low tones seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves, creating an unsettling sensation that witnesses struggled to describe clearly. One French survey report from the early 20th century mentioned an underground cavity where a spoken word could return several seconds later, distorted and deeper in tone, as though the chamber itself were responding. At first glance, mainstream explanations seem straightforward enough. Ancient architecture often incorporated deliberate acoustic engineering. Temples, tombs, and ceremonial halls across the ancient world were carefully designed to amplify voices, chants, and ritual sounds. Stone curvature, enclosed spaces, and hidden cavities can create powerful resonance effects even in relatively small structures. Similar phenomena have been documented in Egyptian tombs, Greek theaters, and underground sanctuaries throughout the Mediterranean. Some archaeologists believe the chambers beneath Palmyra may have served religious or ceremonial purposes connected to sound. Priests speaking within resonant spaces could have appeared almost supernatural to ancient audiences, their voices transformed by the architecture itself. Yet not every detail fits comfortably within that explanation. A number of the reported chambers do not appear connected to temples or public structures at all. Some are isolated deep beneath residential districts. Others seem unfinished, with rough stone walls lacking the decorative features normally associated with ceremonial spaces. More puzzling still are accounts from later expeditions describing sounds with no obvious source. Workers involved in excavations during the 1930s reportedly heard rhythmic vibrations beneath the ground at night, even when no digging was taking place nearby. One account described a distant humming noise that seemed to rise and fade beneath the desert floor shortly before sunrise. Another claimed that metallic echoes could occasionally be heard deep within sealed corridors where no passage appeared to continue. Could shifting stone and underground pressure explain these experiences? Modern geologists note that desert environments can produce unusual acoustic conditions. Changes in temperature cause stone to expand and contract, sometimes generating deep resonant sounds within underground cavities. Wind passing through narrow shafts may also create tones resembling distant voices or vibrations. Certain desert dunes are even known to produce low-frequency humming noises under specific conditions. And yet, the legends surrounding Palmyra have continued to shape interpretations of these discoveries. Local traditions long spoke of hidden chambers beneath the city containing sacred knowledge, royal treasures, or records preserved from civilizations older than Rome itself. Some stories described underground passageways extending for miles beneath the desert, sealed after catastrophes whose details were lost to time. Fringe theories have expanded on these legends in dramatic ways. Some researchers speculate that the chambers formed part of a forgotten communication network designed to carry sound across the city underground. Others suggest they may have been linked to ancient spiritual practices involving resonance and altered states of consciousness. A few even propose that unexplored sections beneath Palmyra could conceal structures far older than the visible Roman-era city above. If the hidden chambers beneath Palmyra seem to preserve echoes from another age, then the next mystery shifts our attention upward, to the skies above the ancient Near East, where medieval monks recorded an event so strange that even centuries later, historians remain uncertain how to interpret it. In isolated monasteries scattered across the mountains and deserts of Syria and Upper Mesopotamia, Syriac scribes spent generations copying sacred texts by candlelight. Their world was one of silence, prayer, and careful observation. These monks were not writing myths in the traditional sense. Many saw themselves as chroniclers of real events: wars, eclipses, famines, comets, earthquakes, and signs they believed reflected deeper truths about the world around them. And among these writings appears one of the most unusual descriptions preserved in medieval records. Several Syriac manuscripts refer to what modern researchers sometimes call the glass rain. The accounts vary in detail, but the central image remains remarkably consistent. According to the texts, sometime during the early medieval period, fragments clear as crystal were said to fall from the sky during a violent atmospheric event. Witnesses described hearing sharp impacts against stone rooftops and monastery walls. Some claimed the fragments shattered upon contact. Others insisted they remained intact and could cut skin like sharpened ice. One monk described the ground glittering beneath moonlight after the storm had passed, as though the earth had been covered in broken mirrors. At first glance, the reports may sound symbolic or exaggerated. Medieval religious writings often used vivid language to describe natural disasters or celestial phenomena. Historians caution that translation itself complicates interpretation. Syriac terminology for crystal, glass, ice, and certain minerals can overlap depending on context. Even so, the mystery deepens when the descriptions are examined more closely. The texts do not describe ordinary hailstones. The falling material was repeatedly said to be unusually transparent and sharp-edged. One account claimed the fragments remained visible on the ground long after sunrise without melting. Another referred to local villagers collecting pieces and storing them inside cloth containers out of fear and fascination. So what exactly did these witnesses see? Mainstream explanations generally focus on rare meteorological or geological events. Some researchers believe the monks may have witnessed an extreme hailstorm combined with airborne silica-rich desert material, creating the illusion of glass-like debris. Others point to naturally occurring volcanic glass or mineral fragments carried long distances by violent atmospheric currents. There is also the possibility of a meteor airburst. Modern scientists have documented cases in which meteoric material entering Earth's atmosphere melts surrounding sand and minerals into glass-like substances. The intense heat generated during such events can produce tiny fragments of fused silica, sometimes scattered across large areas. In regions already rich in desert sand, the effect could appear deeply unnatural to observers unfamiliar with the phenomenon. And yet, certain elements remain difficult to explain completely. The manuscripts repeatedly emphasize silence immediately before the event. Birds reportedly disappeared from the area. Animals became restless. Then came what one text described as a shining disturbance in the night sky, followed by the fall itself. Could these descriptions reflect a fragmented memory of an astronomical event now lost to history? Some fringe theories suggest the glass rain may preserve evidence of a meteor impact or atmospheric explosion far larger than historians currently recognize. Others connect the writings to ancient traditions describing heavenly stones or divine warnings descending from the sky. A few researchers have explored an even stranger possibility, that the monks witnessed the aftermath of a distant volcanic eruption, powerful enough to send unusual mineral debris across vast regions. Historical climate records confirm that several unexplained atmospheric disturbances occurred during late antiquity and the early medieval era, including darkened skies and sudden temperature shifts. But there are still unanswered questions. No confirmed physical samples linked to the event have ever been identified. The original manuscripts survive only in fragments and copies made centuries later. Some passages appear damaged or incomplete, leaving historians uncertain whether important details were lost over time. And then there is the deeper question surrounding the monks themselves. If the glass rain recorded in Syriac monasteries revealed how the sky itself can still surprise even careful observers, then the next account shifts our attention eastward, into the vast frontiers of early imperial China, where the land itself was said to behave in ways that defied expectation. Along the rugged corridors of what would later connect to the northern edges of the Silk Road, Han Dynasty scouts once mapped territories that stretched into mountains, valleys, and windswept plateaus. These were not just military reports. They were careful records of terrain, supply routes, water sources, and occasionally phenomena that did not fit easily within the language of geography. Among these scattered records appears a curious reference often translated as the strange mountain that pulls the carriage. The account, preserved in fragmented historical annotations associated with the Han court during the 2nd century BC, describes an area where traveling caravans reportedly experienced an unusual force. Horses slowed unexpectedly. Metal fittings on carts seemed heavier than normal. In some versions, scouts claimed that iron objects placed on the ground would shift slightly toward a particular slope without human intervention. At first glance, the description appears almost mythic. Ancient military records were typically practical, focused on taxation routes, troop movement, and terrain obstacles. Yet this particular report survives in multiple references across later commentaries, suggesting it may have been considered noteworthy rather than purely symbolic. So, what might the scouts have encountered? Modern interpretations begin with geology. Certain mineral formations are known to create localized magnetic anomalies. Rocks rich in magnetite or other iron compounds can subtly influence compass readings or interact with metallic objects in ways that were not understood in antiquity. In regions where ore deposits lie close to the surface, even simple tools or wagons could behave unpredictably over short distances. Some researchers point to naturally magnetized rock formations found in parts of Central Asia and Western China, where tectonic activity has shaped complex underground structures over millions of years. Under specific conditions, these formations can produce measurable but localized magnetic fields strong enough to affect navigation instruments, though not typically strong enough to physically pull heavy objects in the dramatic way described in the text. And yet, the Han reports are not limited to navigation errors alone. One passage describes a silent incline where direction is lost. suggesting that scouts found their sense of orientation unreliable in the area. Another mentions repeated attempts to establish fixed bearings, only for compasses, if later translators are correct in their interpretation, to behave inconsistently or drift without clear cause. This raises an important question. Were these observations literal, or were they written through the lens of later understanding? The compass, as a fully developed navigational tool, was not widely used in the early Han period in the same form it would later take in medieval China. This opens the possibility that later scribes, interpreting older records, may have projected contemporary concepts onto earlier descriptions of disorientation in the field. Still, alternative interpretations continue to circulate. Some geophysicists suggest that the phenomenon could be explained by rare combinations of iron-rich soils and steep geological gradients, creating optical and physical illusions that affect movement perception. In desert or high-altitude environments, heat shimmer, uneven ground resistance, and mineral density variations can all subtly alter how motion is experienced by travelers. Fringe theories, however, move beyond conventional geology. A few researchers have speculated that the site may correspond to a long-forgotten meteorite impact zone, where metallic fragments became embedded in the earth, creating irregular magnetic behavior across a localized area. Others suggest that the Han scouts may have encountered early observations of a naturally occurring magnetic anomaly so unusual that it was later preserved as an extraordinary account rather than a routine geographical note. There are even interpretations rooted in ancient cosmological thinking. In Han-era philosophy, landforms were sometimes understood as expressions of hidden forces, currents of energy flowing through mountains and valleys. Within that framework, an area that pulls or resists movement might not have been seen as purely physical, but as a place where balance between Earth forces was disrupted or intensified. But no physical site has ever been definitively matched to the descriptions in the surviving texts. If the Han scouts once recorded landscapes where direction itself seemed to falter, then the trail of historical uncertainty continues westward into the crossroads of empires where records become thinner and silence begins to fill the gaps between surviving fragments. High along the ancient trade arteries of Central and South Asia, the Kushan Empire once flourished as a bridge between worlds, linking the Roman East, the Iranian Plateau, and the great river valleys of the subcontinent. Cities thrived under its rule, and royal courts preserved knowledge drawn from many traditions. Coins, inscriptions, and temple remains still testify to a sophisticated political and cultural system that reached its height between roughly the 1st and 3rd centuries AD. Yet among the archaeological and textual traces attributed to this period, there exists a recurring and unresolved absence, a reference, repeated indirectly in later accounts, to what scholars sometimes call the Ivory archive of the Kushan court. Unlike stone inscriptions or metal records, ivory was a material reserved for prestige and delicacy. Carved panels, ceremonial tablets, and ornamental documents were known across the ancient world, often used in royal courts for recording decrees, genealogies, and sacred knowledge in a form meant to symbolize permanence and authority. In the Kushan context, ivory appears frequently in art and luxury objects, suggesting access to extensive trade networks stretching deep into the Indian subcontinent and beyond. But the archive itself, if it ever existed, has never been recovered. Some historical reconstructions, drawn from fragmented references in later Central Asian manuscripts, suggest that the Kushan court may have maintained a collection of ivory tablets or panels inscribed with administrative, religious, or astronomical records. These accounts describe a repository stored within a royal complex, possibly guarded and restricted, where knowledge was preserved not on fragile parchment, but on polished ivory surfaces meant to endure. Then, at some point, the trail fades. No definitive archaeological discovery has ever confirmed the existence of such an archive. Yet the idea persists in scholarly footnotes, not as established fact, but as a recurring possibility, an absence that appears too structured to dismiss entirely. So, what might explain it? The most grounded interpretation is simple. The archive may never have existed in the formalized sense described in later traditions. Kushan record-keeping, while advanced, likely relied on a combination of materials: wood, bark, metal, and parchment-like substances. Ivory, though prestigious, may have been used sparingly for ceremonial objects rather than systematic documentation. Organic materials, as always, leave little trace. Time, climate, and conflict erase far more than they preserve. The Kushan territories, spanning diverse and often unstable regions, experienced centuries of political change after the empire's decline. Libraries, if they existed, could have been dismantled, repurposed, or simply lost to decay. And yet, the story does not end there. Some archaeologists have pointed to scattered ivory fragments discovered in regions once under Kushan influence, intricately carved pieces whose original purpose remains unclear. Could these be remnants of a larger system of record-keeping now destroyed or dispersed? Or are they simply artistic artifacts, later misinterpreted as part of a lost administrative structure? Fringe interpretations expand further into uncertainty. A few researchers have speculated that the Ivory Archive may represent not a single physical library, but a network of dispersed records carried between Kushan cities, portable archives transported along trade routes, vulnerable to loss and fragmentation. Others suggest that later Buddhist and Central Asian scribes may have preserved distorted memories of Kushan intellectual life, transforming metaphorical references to white records or sacred bone writings into the idea of a literal ivory repository. There are even more speculative theories that link the concept to ritual symbolism. In some ancient traditions, ivory was associated with purity, memory, and divine authority. Could the archive have been less a physical structure and more a ceremonial ideal, a way of describing knowledge believed to be protected by spiritual significance rather than physical containment? If the supposed ivory archive of the Kushan court speaks to how knowledge itself can disappear without leaving a clear trace, then the mystery now shifts once again, southwest, into the vast desert margins where trade routes once stitched together some of the most distant corners of the ancient world. Along the shores of the Persian Gulf, where salt flats meet shimmering heat and the horizon seems to dissolve into light, the ancient trading city of Gerrha once stood as a powerful commercial hub. Classical sources describe Gerrha as a wealthy entrepot, enriched by incense, spices, pearls, and goods carried across Arabia from the Red Sea to Mesopotamia. Caravans moved in and out of its gates like slow, rhythmic tides, each journey dependent on water, navigation knowledge, and fragile human endurance against the desert. And among these recorded routes appears a brief, unsettling reference: the vanishing of a camel caravan that never reached its destination. The accounts survive only in fragments, preserved through later classical references and reconstructed trade histories. According to these records, a caravan departing from Gerrha, loaded with goods destined for northern markets, entered the desert along a known route and then disappeared entirely from the historical record. No confirmed arrival, no verified wreckage, no surviving witnesses. In a world where trade was meticulously documented, such silence is itself unusual. So what could have happened in the open desert, where movement is visible and survival depends on predictable paths between wells? The most grounded explanations begin with environment and logistics. Desert caravans faced constant risks: sandstorms capable of erasing tracks within hours, sudden shifts in dune landscapes, exhaustion of animals, or depletion of water supplies. A caravan lost to navigation error could, in theory, be consumed by the desert without leaving recoverable traces, especially if it strayed far from known wells. There is also the possibility of conflict. Gerrha's trade networks extended into regions shaped by shifting alliances and competition. Banditry, territorial disputes, or regional instability could have disrupted routes without leaving clear historical records, especially if accounts were lost or deliberately omitted in later copying traditions. Yet the story of this vanished caravan persists not because of certainty, but because of what it suggests about the limits of historical visibility. Some researchers have explored environmental anomalies specific to the region. Certain desert zones are known for extreme mirage effects, where distant objects appear displaced or inverted due to temperature gradients. In rare conditions, experienced travelers can lose directional awareness entirely, mistaking visual distortions for real landmarks. Combined with wind-driven sand movement, entire paths can be effectively rewritten within a single season. But the Gerrha account is sometimes interpreted as going further than simple misdirection. Later interpretive traditions hint that the caravan may have entered a region considered unusually disorienting even by seasoned guides, an area where navigation markers behaved inconsistently or where routes seemed to shift over time. Whether this reflects real geographical difficulty or symbolic storytelling remains uncertain. Fringe theories extend the mystery even further. Some suggest the caravan may have been lost not gradually, but suddenly, caught in a rare atmospheric event such as an intense dust vortex or localized storm system capable of erasing both visibility and orientation within moments. Others propose that the caravan may have been deliberately rerouted or absorbed into another trade network, its identity lost through administrative fragmentation rather than physical disappearance. There are even more speculative interpretations that draw on ancient maritime desert parallels. In some traditions, deserts were imagined as spaces of transition rather than emptiness, regions where travelers could vanish, not only physically but administratively, becoming absorbed into other cultural or trade spheres without record continuity. And yet, no definitive archaeological trace has ever been linked to this specific caravan. No recovered cargo, no inscriptions marking its fate, no confirmed stop along its intended path. Only absence remains. Which raises a quieter question, one that lingers beyond the specifics of Gerrha itself. How many caravans, journeys, and human stories have simply dissolved into environments too vast to preserve them? Standing at the edge of that question, we are left with the same uneasy realization that shadows so many ancient mysteries. Sometimes history does not preserve endings. It only preserves the brief moment before they disappear. If the vanished caravan of Gerrha reminds us how easily entire journeys can dissolve into silence, then the mystery now shifts again, this time to the banks of the Nile, where stone, water, and time have been intertwined for thousands of years. In Upper Egypt, where the river narrows and the desert presses close to the cultivated land, stands the ancient temple complex of Temple of Esna. From the outside, its sandstone structure appears partially buried, as if the earth itself has slowly risen to reclaim it. Only the monumental entrance and hypostyle hall remain visible above modern street level, while much of the temple lies deeper, beneath centuries of accumulated sediment and reconstruction. It is within this layered history that references to hidden chambers beneath Esna begin to appear. The Temple of Esna was dedicated primarily to Khnum, the ram-headed deity associated with creation and the shaping of life on the potter's wheel. Like many Greco-Roman period temples in Egypt, its walls were later inscribed with astronomical texts, ritual calendars, and detailed religious scenes carved during the Ptolemaic and Roman eras. These inscriptions reflect a world in which religion, science, and cosmology were deeply intertwined, each reinforcing the other through symbolic architecture. But scattered among modern archaeological notes and early excavation reports are occasional references to anomalies beneath the visible structure. Subterranean voids, narrow passages, chambers that appear to extend beyond expected temple foundations. At first, these observations are often explained in practical terms. Egyptian temples were frequently rebuilt, expanded, and modified over centuries. Earlier structures were buried beneath later phases. Foundations could contain storage rooms, ritual spaces, or structural voids designed to stabilize massive stone constructions. In some cases, underground chambers were used for storing sacred objects or housing ritual equipment not meant for public view. So the idea of hidden spaces beneath Esna is not, in itself, unusual. And yet, certain details resist simple categorization. Some survey reports describe chambers that do not align cleanly with known architectural plans. In limited geophysical scans conducted around the temple precinct, irregular cavities have been suggested beneath sections not typically associated with storage or structural reinforcement. Their shapes, in some interpretations, appear less like functional rooms and more like extended corridors or incomplete spaces whose purpose remains unclear. What were these voids meant for, if anything at all? Mainstream archaeology tends to caution against overinterpretation. Subsurface anomalies can result from natural erosion, collapsed masonry, or water-induced cavities formed over millennia in river-adjacent soil. The Nile's constant shifting has buried and reshaped countless structures, sometimes leaving behind misleading voids that resemble intentional architecture. Still, the persistence of references to lower chambers in Esna invites further curiosity. Some researchers have speculated that these spaces may be remnants of earlier temple phases predating the visible Ptolemaic structure, possibly linked to older cult practices that were later incorporated or overwritten. Egypt's sacred sites often evolved continuously, with new sanctuaries built directly atop older ones, preserving fragments of earlier religious landscapes beneath later stonework. In this sense, the chambers beneath Esna may represent a palimpsest of belief systems layered over centuries, each civilization building upon and partially concealing the one before it. But there are other interpretations as well. A few fringe theories suggest that the temple complex may conceal deliberately sealed spaces associated with ritual secrecy, areas intended only for high priests or restricted ceremonies tied to esoteric knowledge. Ancient Egyptian religious practice did include hidden sanctuaries and restricted access rooms in certain temples, where symbolic reenactments of creation myths or funerary rites were performed away from public view. Could Esna contain such spaces, now forgotten or physically inaccessible? Even more speculative interpretations propose that subterranean anomalies might connect to a broader, partially undocumented network of chambers beneath Upper Egyptian temples, an idea occasionally mentioned in alternative archaeological discussions, but never confirmed through systematic excavation. And yet, despite decades of study, no definitive map of these supposed lower structures has been produced. Access beneath the temple remains limited, and much of the surrounding area is constrained by modern construction, groundwater levels, and preservation concerns. So the chambers remain, in many ways, just at the edge of certainty, suggested but not fully revealed, measured but not fully understood. If the hidden chambers beneath Esna suggest that entire spaces of the ancient world may still lie concealed beneath our feet, then the next mystery shifts further south, into the warm winds and river valleys of Nubia, where the Nile bends through a landscape once ruled by powerful and deeply symbolic kingdoms. Along the upper reaches of the Nile, in what is now northern Sudan, rose the ancient city of Meroë, capital of the kingdom of Kush during its later phase. Here, pyramids smaller yet more numerous than those of Egypt still stand against the desert sky, their steep angles etched into the horizon like silent markers of a vanished political and spiritual order. Meroë was a center of iron production, royal ceremony, and distinctive artistic tradition, shaped by both local innovation and long-standing exchange with Egypt and the wider African and Mediterranean worlds. Among the many fragments of its cultural record, stone inscriptions, temple ruins, and burial sites, there exists a recurring reference in later historical interpretations to a group often called, for lack of a clearer designation, the Painted Priests of Meroë. According to reconstructed accounts drawn from fragmented classical references and Nubian oral traditions recorded centuries later, these priests were said to play a central role in ritual ceremonies tied to kingship, astronomy, and seasonal cycles. They were reportedly distinguished by their elaborate body paint, patterns of ochre, charcoal, and mineral pigments applied in symbolic designs that marked rank, function, or spiritual alignment. In temple reliefs and burial art associated with Kushite elites, figures resembling ritual specialists do appear, sometimes depicted in ceremonial procession or performing sacred acts before royal figures and deities. These images suggest a structured priestly system, deeply integrated into the political and religious life of Meroë. And yet, at a certain point in the historical record, the painted priests seem to fade. There is no single documented event marking their disappearance, no recorded decree abolishing their order, no confirmed archaeological evidence showing a sudden disruption of their role. Instead, what remains is a gradual thinning of references until the figure of the painted ritual specialist becomes increasingly symbolic rather than clearly defined. So, what happened to them? The most conventional explanation points to political and cultural transformation. The kingdom of Kush underwent significant changes over centuries, including shifts in trade routes, external pressures, and evolving religious practices. As power structures changed, so too would have the institutions tied to older ceremonial systems. Priesthoods in the ancient world were often closely linked to specific dynasties or ritual traditions, and when those traditions faded, the roles attached to them could dissolve without formal record. Environmental and archaeological factors also play a role in this uncertainty. Many structures at Meroë remain only partially excavated. Sand encroachment, erosion, and limited excavation resources have left large portions of the city unstudied. It is possible that evidence of later priestly activity simply remains buried, awaiting discovery beneath layers of desert soil. But the story becomes more complex when considering the symbolic importance of body paint itself. In Kushite culture, visual transformation through adornment was not merely decorative. It carried ritual significance, potentially indicating spiritual states, social hierarchy, or participation in specific ceremonies. Some researchers suggest that the painted priests may not have been a fixed institutional group, but rather a ritual role adopted under certain conditions, seasonal, political, or ceremonial, rather than a permanent caste. If that is the case, their disappearance may reflect not extinction, but transformation. Still, alternative interpretations continue to circulate in academic margins and comparative mythology studies. Some scholars have proposed that the painted priests could represent a class of ritual specialists whose functions were gradually absorbed into other religious structures, especially as external influences from Egypt and later cultures reshaped Nubian spiritual life. Others suggest that their identity may have been deliberately obscured in later historical narratives, as new religious frameworks reinterpreted older practices through different symbolic lenses. There are even more speculative ideas that view the painted rituals as part of a broader system of knowledge, one involving astronomy, seasonal prediction, and state legitimacy, where the priests functioned as both spiritual intermediaries and custodians of environmental understanding. In this view, their disappearance would not be sudden, but gradual, as shifting political systems no longer required their specific role. If the painted priests of Meroë remind us how entire traditions can fade until only fragments remain, Then the journey now turns across the Red Sea corridor and into the rugged highlands of southern Arabia, where stone, wind, and silence preserve traces of another forgotten world. In the arid landscapes of what is now Yemen, where jagged mountains rise above dry valleys and seasonal winds carve paths through rock, the ancient Himyarite kingdom once held sway. Flourishing between roughly the 2nd century BC and the early centuries AD, Himyar controlled key trade routes that linked the incense-rich regions of Arabia with the wider networks of the Mediterranean, East Africa, and South Asia. Cities and fortresses stood along caravan paths, while inscriptions in early South Arabian script recorded royal decrees, religious dedications, and commercial transactions. But beyond the visible ruins of settlements and inscriptions carved into stone, there are scattered references, archaeological notes, local traditions, and fragmentary survey reports that point toward something far less understood: the so-called cave shrines associated with Himyarite religious practice. Unlike the monumental temples of neighboring civilizations, these shrines are described as being partially or entirely carved into natural rock formations, hidden within cliff faces, mountain slopes, or deep desert ravines. Some are said to have been accessible only through narrow, winding passages, where daylight fades quickly and the air becomes still and cool against the heat outside. Mainstream archaeology confirms that pre-Islamic South Arabian cultures did use a variety of sacred spaces, including open-air sanctuaries, stone altars, and occasionally rock-cut chambers. Religious practice in the region was diverse, shaped by a mixture of local deities, astral worship traditions, and influences from neighboring civilizations through trade and migration. Yet the cave shrines attributed to the Himyarite period remain only partially documented. In a few surveyed sites, archaeologists have identified niches carved into rock faces, sometimes containing faint traces of soot or pigment, suggesting the use of fire or ritual lighting. Other locations show faint inscriptions or symbolic markings near natural cave entrances, though their interpretation remains uncertain due to erosion and incomplete preservation. What purpose did these secluded spaces serve? One interpretation suggests they functioned as small-scale ritual sites used by local communities or traveling merchants, places for offering prayers, seeking protection, or marking transitions along dangerous caravan routes. In this view, the caves were not grand temples, but intimate sanctuaries embedded within the landscape itself, reflecting a spiritual practice closely tied to survival and movement through harsh terrain. But the mystery deepens when considering the placement of some of these sites. Certain reported cave shrines appear in locations that are difficult to access even today, high in cliffs or hidden behind natural rock formations that require precise knowledge of the terrain. This has led some researchers to suggest that these spaces may have held specialized ritual significance, possibly reserved for select individuals or specific ceremonial functions. Could these caves have been part of a broader sacred geography, where mountains and ravines were seen not as empty landscapes, but as structured spiritual pathways? In ancient South Arabian belief systems, deities were often associated with natural forces: rain, wind, fertility, and celestial cycles. Sacred space did not always require constructed temples. Sometimes the landscape itself was considered a living expression of divine presence. Within such a framework, a cave might not be a hidden structure, but a threshold between worlds. Still, alternative perspectives continue to emerge. Some scholars propose that certain cave shrines may have been used as temporary refuges during periods of conflict or political instability, later reinterpreted as ritual sites. Others suggest that trade caravans passing through the region could have adopted and adapted older sacred spaces, layering new meanings onto pre-existing natural formations over generations. There are also more speculative interpretations that view the cave shrines as part of a lost network of regional sanctuaries, small, interconnected ritual points used for seasonal gatherings, astronomical observation, or oral transmission of religious knowledge. In this theory, the caves would represent not isolated sites, but fragments of a larger cultural system now only partially visible. And yet, no comprehensive excavation has fully mapped or confirmed such a network. If the forgotten cave shrines of the Himyarite highlands reveal how belief can be carved directly into stone and landscape, then the journey now moves further east, into the dry, shifting edges of the Tarim Basin, where deserts have preserved and erased history in equal measure. Here, near the remnants of the ancient Oasis settlement of Loulan, once stood a crossroads city along the Silk Road, an essential stop between China, Central Asia, and the wider networks of Eurasian trade. Loulan thrived in a delicate balance with its environment, dependent on river systems that gradually shifted course over time, ultimately contributing to its decline and abandonment. But long after the city faded into the desert, modern expeditions began uncovering something unexpected in its surrounding sands. A series of bone artifacts, flat, carefully shaped pieces, bearing markings that have yet to be conclusively translated. These so-called bone tablets are not part of any widely recognized writing system. Some were found near burial sites, others scattered in what appear to be domestic or administrative contexts. Their surfaces carry incised symbols, lines, and patterns that do not match known scripts from Han China, early Indo-European languages, or neighboring Central Asian cultures. At first, scholars approached them cautiously. Bone was a common medium in ancient societies, used for tools, divination, musical instruments, and ritual objects. In early China, oracle bone inscriptions are among the earliest known forms of writing, used for communicating with ancestral or spiritual forces. The presence of inscribed bone material near Loulan initially suggested a possible cultural connection or influence from Han administrative practices expanding westward along the Silk Road. Yet the markings found near Loulan resist straightforward classification. Some sequences appear structured, repeating with subtle variations, as though following an underlying system. Others resemble abstract symbolic arrangements rather than direct linguistic communication. A few fragments even show overlapping inscriptions, suggesting reuse or layering of meaning over time. So, what were these objects intended to record? Mainstream interpretations remain grounded in caution. Many archaeologists propose that the bone tablets may not represent writing at all, but rather mnemonic devices, ritual tokens, counting tools, or symbolic markers used in trade or local governance. In environments where multiple cultures intersected, hybrid systems of notation could emerge that do not survive in later linguistic traditions. Another possibility is that these artifacts belong to a now lost local script that was never widely adopted or preserved in written records. The Silk Road was not only a route of major civilizations, but also a corridor of smaller, transient cultures whose languages and systems may have vanished without leaving descendant traditions. But the mystery deepens when considering the condition in which some of these tablets were found. A number of specimens show signs of deliberate breakage before burial or deposition, while others appear carefully placed rather than discarded. In certain cases, tablets were discovered in clusters, arranged in patterns that do not obviously correspond to functional use. This has led some researchers to question whether their purpose extended beyond administration or communication. Could they have been ritual objects, used in ceremonies tied to travel, protection, or memory along the Silk Road? Some speculative interpretations suggest that the bone tablets may have served as a form of encoded knowledge, perhaps used by merchant guilds or traveling communities to preserve information across generations in a fragile desert environment. Others propose they could be remnants of divinatory practices, where bone surfaces were inscribed and interpreted in ways that were never fully standardized. There are even more uncertain theories that place the artifacts within a broader network of symbolic communication systems that once connected oasis cities across the Tarim Basin, systems that may have functioned more like visual or ritual languages than written scripts in the modern sense. And yet, despite decades of study, no definitive translation has been achieved. No bilingual inscription has been found to anchor interpretation. No surviving cultural tradition clearly preserves their meaning. Loulan itself offers little assistance. Buried beneath shifting sands and time, much of the city remains only partially excavated, its outer structures exposed while its deeper layers remain inaccessible or lost to erosion. So the bone tablets remain suspended between categories: artifacts without a confirmed language, messages without a known recipient. And perhaps that is what makes them so compelling, because they sit at the edge of what we can recognize as writing and what we can only interpret as symbol, between communication and silence. B. If the untranslated bone tablets near ancient Loulan hint at messages we can no longer read, then the story continues deeper into the shifting sands of the Tarim Basin, where entire cities did not fall in fire or war, but instead seemed to simply fade into silence. South of Loulan, along the fragile edges of what was once a network of Silk Road oases, lay the ancient settlement of Qarqan. Known in some historical references as an oasis city sustained by river-fed agriculture and caravan trade, Qarqan once stood as a quiet but vital link between larger urban centers scattered across the desert frontier. Today, what remains is not a city in the traditional sense, but traces: ruined walls half buried in sand, fragments of irrigation channels, and scattered artifacts that suggest a once organized settlement life built around water that no longer flows. Unlike cities destroyed by invasion or fire, Qarqan presents a different kind of archaeological question. What does it mean for a city to disappear without a clear moment of destruction? Excavations and surveys in the broader region indicate that many oasis settlements in the southern Tarim Basin were highly dependent on shifting river systems fed by meltwater from distant mountain ranges. These waterways were not stable. Over centuries, they gradually changed course, sometimes drying up entirely, forcing communities to relocate or dissolve. In this context, the collapse of Qarqan is often interpreted as a slow environmental transition rather than a sudden catastrophe. But the archaeological record, as incomplete as it is, leaves behind subtle irregularities. Some habitation layers show evidence of abrupt abandonment, domestic objects left in place, storage vessels partially filled, and architectural spaces not fully cleared before being deserted. In other layers, there is a gradual thinning of occupation, as if residents left over time rather than in a single coordinated migration. So, which story is closer to the truth? Environmental explanations remain the most widely accepted. Climate shifts, desertification, and watercourse changes are well-documented forces in the Tarim Basin's history. When irrigation systems fail in such an environment, survival becomes nearly impossible. Entire communities can disperse within a generation, absorbed into neighboring settlements or lost to migration routes that leave little archaeological trace. Yet, Qarqan's case raises additional questions. Unlike some neighboring sites, there is limited evidence of long-term resettlement nearby after its decline. This absence has led some researchers to wonder whether environmental change alone fully explains the pattern observed. Could there have been a tipping point, an event or sequence of events that accelerated abandonment beyond gradual ecological pressure? Some speculative interpretations suggest localized ecological collapse, where soil salinization or groundwater depletion reached a threshold that made continued habitation impossible in a relatively short span of time. Others point to the possibility of trade route realignment, where shifting Silk Road pathways diverted economic lifelines away from the Oasis, leaving it functionally obsolete even before complete environmental failure. There are also more interpretive theories that frame Qarqan's disappearance within the broader rhythm of desert civilizations, places where survival depended on fragile balances between human engineering and natural water systems. In this view, collapse is not an anomaly, but a recurring pattern across the region's history. And yet, even within these explanations, certain details remain unresolved. Why do some architectural remains appear structurally intact yet unused in their final phases of occupation? Why are certain storage areas sealed as if preserved intentionally, rather than abandoned in haste? And why do oral traditions preserved in later regional accounts occasionally refer to silent oases that vanished without conflict or visible disaster? These fragments do not form a complete narrative. Instead, they hover at the edges of interpretation. Fringe theories occasionally step into this space of uncertainty. Some propose that Qarqan may have been part of a wider network of oasis settlements that experienced synchronized decline due to regional climate oscillations not yet fully understood. Others suggest that shifts in trade politics along the Silk Road may have led to deliberate relocation policies, gradually emptying smaller settlements in favor of more strategically positioned hubs. There are even more speculative ideas that view Qarqan not as a single collapse, but as part of a cascading sequence of abandonments, where one failing oasis triggered migration pressure on the next, creating a chain reaction across the desert frontier. But no single model has been universally accepted. The silence of Qarqan is not dramatic. It is gradual, layered, almost imperceptible in the archaeological record. A city not erased in a moment, but slowly withdrawn from use until only sand and fragmented memory remain. And so the question persists, echoing across the empty channels and buried foundations. When a city disappears not through destruction but through quiet withdrawal from the landscape, where exactly does its history go, and how much of it might still be resting beneath the desert, waiting to be understood? If the silent collapse of Qarqan shows how a city can fade gradually into environmental silence, then the next mystery shifts across continents and seas, into the rocky highlands of North Africa, where ancient Greek civilization once carved its presence into the edge of the desert. On the eastern Libyan coast lies the ancient city of Cyrene, founded in the 7th century BC by Greek settlers and later flourishing as one of the most important intellectual and cultural centers of the Hellenistic world. Built on a fertile plateau overlooking the Mediterranean, Cyrene was known for its libraries, temples, and philosophical schools, blending Greek traditions with local Libyan influences. Among its ruins, columns weathered by time, stone theaters partially restored by archaeology, and sacred precincts dedicated to Apollo and other deities, there is a more obscure and unsettling reference preserved in scattered excavation notes and fragmented accounts from early explorers: a sealed subterranean chamber, sometimes referred to in modern discussion as the Black Chamber. Unlike the more familiar tombs and cisterns found throughout Cyrene, this chamber is described as unusually isolated, cut deep into the limestone bedrock beneath the ancient city. Reports from early archaeological surveys in the 19th and early 20th centuries mention a blocked entrance, stonework carefully fitted and sealed in a way that suggested deliberate closure rather than collapse. What lay beyond that seal has never been conclusively documented. Some accounts describe the chamber as entirely dark even when partially opened, as though light failed to penetrate its interior fully. Others mention unusual acoustics in the surrounding rock, where sound seemed dampened or absorbed in a way that differed from nearby subterranean spaces used for water storage or burial. Mainstream archaeology approaches such descriptions with caution. Cyrene, like many ancient Greek cities, contains numerous underground structures, cisterns for water collection, burial chambers for elite families, and storage spaces carved into the soft limestone. Over centuries, natural sedimentation and seismic activity could easily alter the appearance and accessibility of such spaces, creating the impression of sealed or hidden chambers where none were originally intended to be secret. And yet, the specific references to deliberate sealing raise additional questions. Why would a chamber beneath a major urban center be carefully closed off rather than repurposed or incorporated into later construction phases? Some researchers suggest a practical explanation. The chamber may have been structurally unstable, requiring permanent closure to prevent collapse or protect surrounding infrastructure. In ancient cities built over extended periods, sealing off dangerous or obsolete underground spaces was not uncommon. But other interpretations move into more uncertain territory. A small number of scholars have speculated that the chamber may have held ritual or administrative significance that later generations chose not to preserve. In ancient Greek religious practice, certain spaces were occasionally restricted or permanently closed after use in sacred rites, particularly those associated with chthonic deities or initiation ceremonies. In such cases, sealing a chamber could represent not abandonment, but preservation through concealment. There are also suggestions that the Black Chamber may not have been a single room at all, but part of a more complex subterranean system that has not yet been fully mapped beneath Cyrene's layered ruins. Limited excavation in certain zones, combined with modern urban constraints above the archaeological site, means that large portions of the ancient city remain unexamined in detail. Could the chamber be part of a broader underground network, still hidden beneath the plateau? Fringe interpretations extend the mystery further. Some propose that the sealed chamber could represent a repository for objects or knowledge deliberately hidden during periods of political instability, perhaps during transitions between Hellenistic, Roman, and later control of the region. Others suggest that it may have been associated with local Libyan religious practices predating or coexisting with Greek influence, later obscured by cultural reinterpretation. A few even speculate that early excavators may have encountered inscriptions or features they could not interpret at the time, leading to partial documentation and cautious sealing rather than full exploration. But no verified excavation report has ever confirmed what lies within. Modern archaeological surveys of Cyrene continue, yet access beneath certain sectors of the ancient city remains limited. Structural concerns, preservation priorities, and incomplete subsurface mapping all contribute to the persistence of unanswered questions. So the chamber remains sealed, not only physically, but within the gaps of historical knowledge itself. And as one stands among the ruins of Cyrene today, looking across stone corridors that once held philosophers, priests, and citizens of a thriving Greek city in North Africa, the question lingers quietly beneath the surface. Was the Black Chamber simply a forgotten utility space closed for safety long ago, or does it represent something more deliberate, something meant to remain unseen, preserved in darkness rather than brought back into the light? If the sealed chamber beneath Cyrene reminds us that some spaces are not forgotten, only closed, then the narrative now moves back eastward, toward the desert frontier where empires rose quickly and fell even more abruptly, leaving behind stories that history only partially preserved. In the heart of the Syrian desert once stood the great city of Palmyra, a crossroads of caravans and cultures where Roman, Persian, and Arab worlds intersected. It was here, in the 3rd century AD, that Queen Zenobia rose to power, ruling as regent and later defying Rome in a bold attempt to carve out an independent Eastern empire. Her story is well recorded in Roman and later classical sources, a ruler of intelligence, ambition, and strategic vision, whose brief empire stretched across much of the eastern provinces before being brought to an end by the forces of Emperor Aurelian. Zenobia herself was captured and taken to Rome. Her political legacy was absorbed into imperial history, but among the many figures tied to her rise and fall, one remains notably absent from the archaeological and textual record: her son. Historical accounts mention that Zenobia had at least one son who was present during the period of her rule, possibly even being prepared as a dynastic successor. Yet after the collapse of her Palmyrene empire, references to his fate become fragmentary, inconsistent, and ultimately silent. And so begins one of the more elusive mysteries connected to Palmyra: the location and existence of his tomb. Palmyra, with its vast necropolis stretching across the desert outskirts, was once filled with elaborate burial towers and underground chambers belonging to elite families. These structures were carefully constructed to preserve lineage and identity, often containing inscriptions, portrait reliefs, and detailed genealogical records. For a royal family such as Zenobia's, burial would have carried profound political and symbolic significance. Yet no confirmed tomb belonging to her son has ever been identified. Some early archaeological surveys of Palmyra noted tomb structures that were damaged, looted, or partially destroyed during later periods of occupation and conflict. In a landscape where stone was frequently reused and inscriptions were erased or repurposed, the loss of identifiable burial markers is not unusual. Over centuries, shifting sands and human activity have obscured much of the city's funerary landscape. From a conventional historical perspective, there are several possible explanations. Zenobia's son may have died during or shortly after the Roman reconquest, with his burial deliberately unmarked to prevent the establishment of a rival dynastic claim. Alternatively, he may have been taken elsewhere as a political hostage, his later life and death recorded under a different identity in Roman records that have not been clearly connected to him. But certainty remains elusive. Some researchers have pointed to gaps in the historical narrative surrounding the final years of the Palmyrene court. While Zenobia's fate is relatively well documented, the disappearance of other royal family members is less clearly traced, leaving room for uncertainty about how complete the surviving accounts truly are. Fringe interpretations take a different approach. A few suggest that the absence of a tomb may indicate deliberate erasure, either by Roman authorities seeking to fully dismantle the symbolic continuity of Zenobia's dynasty, or by later communities who repurposed or concealed burial sites during periods of instability. Others propose that the tomb may exist but remains unrecognized, its inscriptions damaged beyond legibility or misattributed to other elite Palmyrene families. There are even speculative theories that place the missing burial outside Palmyra entirely, suggesting that members of Zenobia's inner circle may have been dispersed across the region after the fall of her empire, their identities absorbed into other political or familial structures. Yet despite extensive excavation of Palmyra's necropolis, no tomb has been definitively linked to her son. The monumental towers, underground vaults, and family burial complexes have been studied in great detail, but the specific trace of his resting place remains absent from the archaeological record. So the question persists, not in the form of certainty, but in the shape of silence. Was the tomb of Zenobia's son destroyed, concealed, or never marked in a way that history could recognize? Or does it still lie somewhere beneath the sands of Palmyra, indistinguishable from the countless other burial chambers that line the ancient city's forgotten edges? And as the desert continues its slow work of covering and revealing the past, one final question remains suspended in that silence. How many stories of power, lineage, and loss have already vanished? Not in destruction, but in absence so complete that even their traces have yet to be found. If the missing tomb of Zenobia's son reminds us how even royal traces can vanish into the silence of desert history, then the journey now shifts westward across the North African landscape, where the sands themselves conceal patterns that appear almost deliberate, yet remain only partially understood. Far from the coastal cities of ancient Carthage, deep within the arid expanses of what is now southern Tunisia, lies a region where the desert floor stretches in long, undisturbed silence. Beneath this surface, satellite surveys and limited ground explorations have hinted at something unexpected: a series of large, circular formations buried beneath layers of sand. These are the so-called stone circles of the Tunisian desert. Unlike the well-known megalithic sites of Europe or the astronomical stone alignments found in other parts of the ancient world, these structures remain largely inaccessible, obscured by shifting dunes and sediment. What is known comes from fragmented remote sensing data, occasional field surveys, and reports from expeditions that have only partially mapped the region. From above, some of these formations appear as faint circular outlines, disturbances in the natural geometry of the desert that suggest intentional arrangement beneath the surface. In certain cases, the patterns seem too regular to be explained by natural erosion alone, yet too buried to confirm their full structure without extensive excavation. So what lies beneath the sand? Mainstream archaeological interpretation approaches these findings cautiously. The region was inhabited and traversed by various ancient cultures, including Berber groups and later Carthaginian and Roman influences. Circular stone arrangements could represent burial structures, ritual enclosures, animal pens, or remnants of temporary settlements that were gradually buried by shifting desert conditions over centuries. In desert environments, time does not erase evenly. It covers. Wind-driven sand can preserve the outlines of human activity while simultaneously erasing its detail, creating ghostly impressions of architecture that appear more complete from a distance than they are in reality. This phenomenon alone can produce shapes that resemble deliberate design, even when no unified structure remains. And yet, certain aspects of the Tunisian circles resist easy classification. Some reported formations appear in clusters, arranged with spacing that suggests a level of planning beyond isolated construction. Others seem partially aligned with subtle variations in terrain elevation or natural geological features that are not immediately visible at ground level. In a few cases, ground-penetrating surveys have indicated layered stone deposits that do not match typical settlement debris patterns. Could these be burial sites belonging to an as-yet unidentified cultural horizon? One interpretation suggests that the circles may be remnants of funerary landscapes, where stone rings marked ancestral resting places across wide desert territories. In many ancient cultures, circular enclosures were associated with cycles of life, death, and continuity, making them a plausible architectural form for ritual or commemorative use. Another possibility is that the formations represent agricultural or water management systems, early attempts to organize scarce resources in an environment defined by extreme aridity. In such a context, circular arrangements might have served practical rather than symbolic purposes, their meaning lost as the environmental conditions that created them changed over time. But there are also interpretations that extend beyond purely functional explanations. Some researchers have suggested that the stone circles could represent remnants of a broader, now lost cultural landscape stretching across North Africa, one in which circular architecture held symbolic or cosmological significance tied to celestial observation, seasonal cycles, or territorial marking systems that have not survived in written records. Fringe theories go further, proposing that the patterns may be part of a prehistoric network of sites whose purpose has been obscured by millennia of desert expansion. In this view, the circles are not isolated anomalies, but fragments of a once connected system of meaning that spanned vast stretches of now empty land. And yet, no definitive excavation has fully confirmed their origin or purpose. The desert itself remains both preservative and barrier, holding shape while withholding context. Even modern technology, while revealing outlines beneath the sand, cannot yet provide a complete picture. What lies below remains partially defined, partially imagined. So the mystery persists, not in what is visible, but in what remains just out of reach. Were these stone circles deliberate constructions marking life, death, or movement across the ancient Tunisian desert? Or are they the accidental signatures of geology and time, misread by modern eyes searching for structure in a landscape that naturally obscures it? And as the wind continues to reshape the dunes above them, one final question lingers quietly beneath the surface. How many other patterns, ancient, intentional, or accidental, still lie hidden beneath deserts that have never been fully seen? If the buried stone circles of the Tunisian desert suggest that meaning can be hidden beneath shifting sands for millennia, then the journey now turns eastward once more, toward a landscape where rock itself seems to behave as if it is still alive. Carved into the rose-colored cliffs of southern Jordan lies the ancient city of Petra. Known for its monumental facades cut directly into sandstone, Petra was once a thriving capital of the Nabatean kingdom, flourishing between the 4th century BC and the 2nd century AD as a critical hub on the incense and spice routes connecting Arabia, Egypt, and the Levant. Today, Petra is celebrated for its architectural precision, its temples, tombs, and theaters emerging from sheer rock faces, as if the city itself was revealed rather than built. But beyond the well-documented grandeur of its visible monuments, there exist scattered references in historical travel accounts and modern geological observations to something far more elusive, the so-called breathing stones. The earliest mentions are not direct descriptions, but fragmented impressions recorded by travelers moving through the region in late antiquity and later centuries. Some spoke of rock faces that seemed to exhale cool air in the heat of the desert day. Others described narrow passages where the stone walls appeared to pulse subtly with temperature shifts, as though the canyon itself was drawing breath. At first glance, these accounts appear poetic rather than scientific. Ancient and medieval travelers often used metaphorical language to describe unfamiliar environmental sensations. In the narrow canyons of Petra, particularly the Syk, the long winding gorge that serves as the main entrance to the city, temperature contrasts can be extreme. Cool air trapped within deep sandstone corridors can rush outward when external heat intensifies, creating a perceptible airflow that might easily be interpreted as something more intentional or animate. Mainstream geology offers grounded explanations. Sandstone formations, especially those shaped over millions of years by water erosion and tectonic stress, are highly porous. This porosity allows for the slow movement of air and moisture within the rock structure. As external temperatures rise and fall between day and night, the expansion and contraction of air inside these formations can produce subtle pressure changes. In narrow passages like those found in Petra, these shifts can become noticeable as faint drafts, sometimes strong enough to feel like a breath against the skin. There is also the role of acoustic resonance. The Syk, with its towering walls that reach up to 80 meters in places, can amplify and distort sound waves, creating auditory illusions that seem to emanate from the rock itself. Wind passing through irregular openings can produce low-frequency vibrations, giving certain sections of canyon the uncanny sensation of movement within stone. Yet even with these explanations, the accounts of the breathing stones retain a curious consistency across time. Travelers from different eras, cultures, and languages independently describe similar sensations: localized cooling in extreme heat, sudden shifts in air pressure, and moments where the stone appears to respond to environmental change in ways that feel almost rhythmic. Not supernatural in the traditional sense, but not entirely ordinary in perception either. So what exactly were they experiencing? Some researchers suggest that the phenomenon may be an example of microclimatic stability zones within deep sandstone canyons. In such environments, airflow is not uniform, but highly channelized. Small differences in pressure between connected cavities can create cyclical air movement, especially when influenced by wind direction and solar heating. Under the right conditions, these cycles could produce repeating sensations of inhalation and exhalation along narrow corridors. Others point to the psychological dimension of the landscape itself. Petra is not only visually dramatic but physically immersive. The transition from open desert into enclosed canyon creates a stark sensory shift. Light narrows, sound compresses, temperature drops. In such environments, human perception becomes highly sensitive to subtle environmental cues, sometimes interpreting natural variation as structured behavior. But there are also interpretations that move beyond purely physical explanations. Some scholars of ancient Nabatean culture have speculated that the inhabitants of Petra may have been deeply attuned to the environmental dynamics of their carved city. Water management was central to Nabatean survival, and the civilization developed advanced systems of channels, cisterns, and hydraulic engineering to sustain life in an arid landscape. It is possible that they understood the movement of air and moisture through rock not as passive geology, but as part of a living system integrated with their city. In this view, the breathing of the stone would not be a myth imposed by later travelers, but an observational language used to describe a real environmental relationship, one where rock, water, and air were perceived as interconnected forces rather than separate elements. And yet, no definitive ancient text explicitly confirms this interpretation. There are also more speculative theories that attempt to connect the phenomenon to less conventional ideas. Some propose that the unique geological composition of Petra's sandstone, rich in iron oxide and layered sediment, may produce rare electromagnetic or thermal effects that subtly influence airflow patterns within confined spaces. Others suggest that the city's extensive system of carved channels and hidden cisterns beneath the surface may still contain undiscovered cavities contributing to localized pressure variations. But despite extensive archaeological study, no single explanation fully captures the consistency of the historical descriptions. Modern visitors to Petra still occasionally report unusual sensations in the Sikh: sudden cool drafts on windless days, localized shifts in sound, and moments where the canyon feels less like static architecture and more like a dynamic environment responding to unseen changes. Whether these experiences are environmental, psychological, or a combination of both remains unresolved. And so the breathing stones remain suspended between explanation and perception, not as a confirmed anomaly, but as a recurring question embedded within one of the world's most studied ancient landscapes. Standing within the narrow passage of Petra, surrounded by towering sandstone walls shaped over millions of years, one final question lingers quietly in the shifting air. Are we witnessing a rare and subtle interaction between geology and climate that ancient travelers instinctively described as breathing? Or is Petra still revealing something about perception itself, where the boundary between living landscape and observed world is not as fixed as we assume? If the breathing stones of Petra remind us that even the most solid landscapes can seem to move with hidden rhythms, then the narrative now turns northward and eastward once again, into the high volcanic plateau of northwestern Iran, where fire, stone, and silence have long shaped both legend and history. Rising above a stark landscape of mountains and wind-swept plains lies the ancient site of Takht-e Soleyman, one of the most significant religious and ceremonial complexes of the ancient Iranian world. Known in antiquity as a sacred Zoroastrian site, it is centered around a volcanic crater lake whose deep, still waters have long been associated with ritual power, royal authority, and cosmic symbolism. For centuries, this location was not merely a settlement, but a sacred landscape. Archaeological evidence shows occupation and construction spanning multiple eras, including Sasanian and earlier Parthian phases, with later modifications during the Mongol period when a Ilkhanid palace complex was built nearby. Temples, fortified walls, and ceremonial structures once encircled the lake, creating a controlled sacred environment where fire and water, the two central elements of Zoroastrian cosmology, coexisted in deliberate balance. Among the most enduring historical questions associated with this site is the reported disappearance of the Guardians of the Fire Temple. According to fragmentary references preserved in later historical accounts and oral traditions, the fire temple at Takht-e Soleyman was maintained by a dedicated group of priests or ritual attendants responsible for preserving the sacred fire, a symbol of divine truth and cosmic order in Zoroastrian belief. These guardians were said to maintain strict ritual purity, tending to the flame continuously and ensuring its uninterrupted existence. And then, at some point in the site's complex history, references to these guardians simply cease. No clear record survives detailing their final fate. No inscription explicitly describes their departure. No verified archaeological layer marks a definitive end to their presence. Instead, there is a gradual fading from the record, an absence that is more suggestive than explanatory. So, what might have happened? From a mainstream historical perspective, several explanations are considered plausible. The region underwent significant political and religious transformations over centuries, particularly during the Islamic conquest of Persia in the 7th century AD. Many Zoroastrian institutions were altered, repurposed, or abandoned during this period. Fire temples across the broader region experienced varying fates. Some were destroyed, others converted, and some simply fell out of use as communities dispersed or adapted to new religious frameworks. In this context, the disappearance of the temple's guardians could reflect institutional dissolution rather than a sudden or mysterious event. As religious authority structures changed, priestly roles tied to specific sacred sites may have gradually diminished, leaving little trace in surviving records. Yet Takht-e Soleyman presents a more complex archaeological picture than simple abandonment. The site shows evidence of continued significance even after major political transitions. The Mongol-era Ilkhanid complex built nearby suggests that the location retained symbolic or strategic importance long after its earlier religious systems had shifted. This raises the question of whether certain aspects of its ritual identity persisted in altered form, even as original custodial groups disappeared. But the silence surrounding the Fire Temple Guardians remains striking. Some researchers have suggested that the Guardians may not have vanished abruptly, but rather been absorbed into changing religious or administrative structures, their roles transformed or redefined under new cultural systems. In such a scenario, continuity would exist, but under different terminology and institutional frameworks, making direct identification difficult. Others point to the possibility of displacement. In periods of political upheaval, religious communities often migrated to safer regions, carrying their traditions with them. If the guardians of Takht-e Soleyman relocated, their practices may have continued elsewhere, detached from the original site that defined their identity. There are also more speculative interpretations that attempt to engage with the symbolic intensity of the site itself. Takht-e Soleyman's volcanic lake has long been associated with mythological narratives of power, mystery, and divine presence. In ancient Iranian cosmology, sacred fire and sacred water were not merely physical elements, but manifestations of deeper cosmic forces. Some fringe interpretations suggest that the guardians may have been part of highly specialized ritual practices that were deliberately concealed or restricted, leading to their eventual disappearance from mainstream historical memory. A few theories extend this idea further, proposing that the fire temple complex may have included ritual spaces or practices that were intentionally withdrawn from public knowledge during periods of doctrinal change. In such interpretations, disappearance is not physical annihilation, but ritual concealment. However, no archaeological evidence definitively supports these claims. Excavations at Takht-e Soleyman have revealed extensive structural remains, but the specific human record of the temple's final custodians remains elusive. Organic materials, inscriptions, and administrative records that might have clarified their fate have not survived in a continuous or readable form. As with many ancient sacred sites, time has preserved architecture more readily than the lives of those who maintained it. And so the question remains suspended in the still air above the crater lake. Standing within the ruins today, surrounded by walls that once defined a powerful sacred complex, one is left with an absence that feels almost intentional, not because something is visibly missing, but because the narrative itself refuses to fully close. Were the guardians of the fire temple gradually absorbed into new historical realities, their roles transformed until they were no longer recognizable in the record? Or did their disappearance mark a more decisive rupture in the continuity of sacred tradition at one of the ancient world's most symbolically charged sites? And as the lake reflects the sky without movement or disturbance, one final question lingers quietly beneath the surface of Takht-e Soleyman. When a sacred flame is no longer tended, does it simply go out? Or does it continue somewhere beyond the reach of history's record? If the silence surrounding the fire temple of Takht-e Soleyman suggests that entire custodial traditions can vanish without a trace, then the journey now moves southward into the dry river plains of Mesopotamia, where another kind of disappearance took place, not of people alone, but of the systems that sustained entire cities. Rising from the flat landscape of northern Mesopotamia, near the modern Iraq-Syria frontier, once stood the ancient city of Hatra. Founded around the 3rd century BC and flourishing particularly under Parthian influence between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD, Hatra was a fortified desert city positioned at the crossroads of major caravan routes. Massive defensive walls, circular in design and reinforced with towers, still mark its former boundaries today, an architectural statement of resilience in an environment defined by instability and shifting political control. Within its fortified structure, Hatra was more than a military stronghold. It was a thriving urban center with temples dedicated to a blend of deities from Mesopotamian, Arabian, and Hellenistic traditions. Its survival depended not only on defense, but on careful management of resources, especially grain. And it is here that one of its lesser-known archaeological mysteries emerges: references to underground granaries that appear to have been used and then abruptly abandoned. Unlike surface storage facilities, which were common across ancient Mesopotamia, these subterranean structures were designed to protect grain from extreme heat, pests, and spoilage. Excavations at Hatra have revealed vaulted chambers beneath certain sections of the city, some interpreted as storage spaces, others still difficult to classify with certainty due to incomplete excavation and structural collapse over time. These underground chambers are not unusual in themselves. What is unusual is the pattern of their use. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of these granary-like spaces were actively maintained for a period, then sealed or left unused while surrounding urban life continued. In certain cases, storage areas appear to have been deliberately blocked with masonry, as if access was intentionally restricted rather than simply abandoned through decay. So why would a city dependent on long-distance trade and resource stability abandon such a critical infrastructure? From a mainstream historical perspective, several explanations are considered plausible. Hatra experienced multiple phases of political pressure and military conflict, particularly during its eventual destruction by Roman forces in the 3rd century AD. In such conditions, urban systems often break down rapidly. Granaries could have been emptied during siege conditions, destroyed in conflict, or repurposed in ways that left little clear archaeological signature. Environmental factors also play a role. Underground storage systems require careful maintenance to prevent moisture intrusion and structural collapse. In arid but occasionally unstable soils like those around Hatra, water infiltration or shifting foundations could have rendered certain chambers unsafe or unusable over time. Yet the archaeological record does not always align neatly with gradual decay. Some granary chambers show signs of relatively organized closure, doorways sealed, storage spaces left partially intact, and in some cases, no evidence of scavenging or secondary reuse. This has led some researchers to question whether the abandonment was entirely reactive or whether it may have involved more deliberate decision-making. What would cause an entire system of subterranean storage to be intentionally sealed? One interpretation suggests a strategic response to instability. During periods of siege or political threat, ancient cities sometimes destroyed or concealed their own resources to prevent enemy access. In this context, sealing granaries could represent a defensive measure rather than abandonment, a way of denying resources to invading forces. Another possibility is economic transformation. As trade routes shifted across Mesopotamia, cities like Hatra experienced changing patterns of supply and demand. If external grain sources became more reliable or politically controlled, internal storage systems may have gradually lost their function, eventually being closed as redundant infrastructure. But the mystery becomes more complex when considering the spatial distribution of these underground chambers. Not all granary-like structures appear within the same zones of the city. Some are located near administrative areas, others closer to residential districts or temple complexes. This irregular distribution has led to speculation that these spaces may have served multiple functions over time, not solely storage, but perhaps also refuge spaces, ritual reserves, or controlled distribution points during periods of crisis. Could they have been part of a more flexible urban system than we currently understand? Fringe interpretations extend this uncertainty further. Some researchers have suggested that Hatra's underground chambers may have been part of a decentralized resource network designed to distribute grain across different sectors of the city in response to seasonal or political pressures. In this view, the granaries were not static warehouses but dynamic systems that were activated, deactivated, and repurposed depending on shifting urban needs. Others propose that some of the sealed chambers may reflect ritual closure practices, where spaces associated with sustenance or survival were symbolically closed after use in times of crisis, perhaps as part of religious or cultural responses to siege, famine, or political transition. There are even more speculative ideas that suggest the underground structures could represent remnants of older construction phases predating the Parthian-era city, later incorporated into Hatra's expanding urban layout, and eventually sealed as the city evolved above them. And yet, despite extensive archaeological surveys, no single interpretation has fully resolved the pattern. Much of Hatra remains partially excavated or exposed only in fragments, its underground architecture still incomplete in the archaeological record. The desert environment has preserved its walls but obscured its interiors, leaving gaps where human activity once moved quietly through stone and shadow. So the granaries remain suspended between function and abandonment. Were they simply victims of war, climate, and shifting trade routes, silent casualties of a city's final collapse? Or do they reflect something more structured in Hatra's urban design, a hidden logic of storage, survival, and concealment that has not yet been fully understood? And as the wind moves across the ruins of Hatra today, passing through arches that once guarded one of the desert's most resilient cities, one question lingers beneath the stone and sand. How much of what we interpret as abandonment was actually part of a system we have not yet learned how to see? If the abandoned underground granaries of Hatra reveal how even the most carefully engineered systems of survival can fall into silence, Then the narrative now turns away from the deserts of Mesopotamia and toward a far more fluid frontier, where land dissolves into sea and the boundaries of perception become harder to define. Along the long, narrow corridor of water separating northeastern Africa from the Arabian Peninsula lies the Red Sea, a route that in antiquity functioned as both a highway of trade and a threshold between worlds. Roman merchants, military expeditions, and provincial administrators all moved through this maritime space, connecting Egypt with Arabia, East Africa, and the broader Indian Ocean trade network. It is within this context that an unusual and fragmentary account emerges from Roman-era writings, a report of shadows moving across the Red Sea. The reference is not found in a single authoritative chronicle, but rather in scattered descriptions attributed to travelers, sailors, and later compilers of geographical knowledge from the Roman world. Authors such as Pliny the Elder and later Greco-Roman geographers documented the Red Sea with a mixture of empirical observation and second-hand maritime testimony, often blending navigational detail with accounts that bordered on the enigmatic. Among these fragmented records is a recurring motif: sailors describing dark shapes beneath or upon the water's surface, appearing to move independently of known vessels, wind patterns, or natural marine phenomena. The descriptions are often inconsistent, yet strangely persistent in theme. Some accounts speak of elongated shadows gliding beneath ships during calm waters, visible only at certain times of day when the sun hangs low and the sea becomes almost mirror-like in stillness. Others describe faint, shifting silhouettes seen at a distance, forms that appear to travel parallel to vessels, yet without any physical source or identifiable structure above the waves. To modern interpretation, the Red Sea is a region rich in optical complexity. Its narrow geography, high salinity, and intense sunlight create conditions where light behaves in unusual ways across the water's surface. Atmospheric refraction, combined with heat shimmer rising from both sea and surrounding desert, can distort perception significantly. In such environments, distant objects may appear displaced, elongated, or inverted, while underwater formations can cast shifting patterns that seem to move independently of their source. Mainstream maritime science offers several grounded explanations. One possibility is that these shadows were optical illusions caused by the interaction of sunlight with submerged reef systems. The Red Sea is known for its extensive coral structures and shallow formations in certain areas. As light passes through moving water and uneven seabeds, it can produce darkened shapes that shift with wave motion, giving the impression of movement beneath the surface. Another explanation involves marine life. Large schools of fish, migratory patterns of sea creatures, or even the movement of sharks and rays near the surface can create dark, coordinated shapes visible from above. When observed from the deck of a ship, especially in low light conditions, such natural formations could easily be interpreted as something more structured or unfamiliar. But the Roman accounts often describe something more elusive than simple biological or optical phenomena. Some sailors reportedly believed these shadows moved with intention, adjusting course in ways that did not align with currents or wind direction. Others claimed the shapes appeared only in specific regions of the sea, particularly along certain trade routes where navigation was already known to be challenging due to reefs, narrow passages, and shifting coastal visibility. Could these observations reflect rare combinations of environmental conditions, light, water density, and atmospheric distortion, occurring simultaneously in ways that produce highly convincing illusions? Or is there something more embedded within the repetition of these accounts? A number of scholars have suggested that ancient maritime cultures often encoded environmental hazards into narrative form. In this interpretation, shadows may have functioned as a descriptive shorthand for dangerous or deceptive waters, areas where navigation was difficult, visibility unreliable, and the risk of shipwreck significantly higher. Over time, such descriptions could evolve into semi-mythical language while still retaining a core of practical observation. Yet the consistency of the motif across different Roman-era references continues to draw attention. Even when separated by geography or author, the idea of moving darkness across the Red Sea appears again and again, as if anchored in shared experience rather than isolated imagination. This has led to more speculative interpretations. Some propose that the accounts may reflect encounters with rare atmospheric phenomena, such as superior mirages or fata morgana effects, where distant objects are projected and distorted across the horizon, creating the illusion of floating or moving forms above or below the waterline. In certain climatic conditions, these mirages can become highly detailed and persist for extended periods, especially in stable air layers over warm sea surfaces. Others suggest the possibility of uncharted maritime activity, perhaps unidentified vessels or floating debris fields carried by currents in ways not fully understood at the time, later interpreted through the symbolic language of shadow and motion. There are even more speculative theories that attempt to place these accounts within a broader ancient understanding of the sea itself, not as empty space, but as a dynamic, almost animate environment where unseen forces were believed to manifest visually under specific conditions. In this view, shadows may not have been literal objects, but perceived expressions of an unpredictable maritime world that defied simple categorization. And yet, no definitive explanation can fully account for the persistence of the narrative across multiple Roman-era references. What remains is a pattern of observation filtered through limited scientific vocabulary, recorded by travelers who were often navigating the edge between known geography and uncertain waters. The Red Sea itself, with its narrow channels, sudden depth changes, and shifting light conditions, remains one of the most visually complex maritime environments in the ancient world. Even today, optical effects in the region can challenge perception and navigation under specific conditions. So the question remains suspended between history and environment. Were the shadows moving across the Red Sea nothing more than a convergence of natural optical effects, light, water, and distance producing illusions that ancient sailors struggled to interpret? Or do these repeated accounts hint at a deeper pattern of observation, where early maritime travelers were documenting something real but not yet fully understood? And as ships once crossed those waters under the same sun that still rises over the Red Sea today, one final question lingers quietly beneath the surface of recorded history. How much of what was once seen at sea was shaped not only by the ocean itself, but by the limits of how it could be understood? If the Roman accounts of shadows moving across the Red Sea suggest that even familiar waters can become sites of uncertainty and misinterpretation, then the narrative now shifts inland once more, toward the marshlands and river channels where Mesopotamia meets the Persian Gulf, and where another mystery was once shaped in metal and time. In the ancient kingdom of Characene, also known in Greco-Roman sources as Messene, a flourishing trade realm emerged between the 2nd century BC and the 3rd century AD. Positioned at the crossroads of the Tigris and Euphrates delta and the maritime routes of the Gulf, Characene was a commercial bridge between Parthian inland territories and the broader Indian Ocean world. Its capital, Charax-Spasinu, stood as a bustling port city where merchants, diplomats, and travelers from multiple cultures converged. Archaeological evidence and historical references indicate a society deeply engaged in trade, coinage, and cultural exchange. Yet, among the material traces that once hinted at its artistic traditions, there is one category of object that has largely vanished from the archaeological record: the so-called bronze masks of Characene. These masks are not widely preserved in museum collections today. In fact, only fragmentary references and isolated finds suggest they ever existed as a distinct cultural artifact type at all. Described in scattered excavation notes and interpreted through comparisons with neighboring artistic traditions, these bronze masks were reportedly crafted as thin metal face coverings or ceremonial visages. Some accounts suggest they were used in ritual contexts, while others propose funerary or representational purposes, possibly associated with elite burials or temple ceremonies. Their surfaces, according to limited descriptions, may have carried stylized human features, eyes, noses, and mouths rendered in simplified but expressive forms. In some interpretations, they were not literal portraits, but symbolic faces representing status, divine association, or ancestral identity. And then, almost abruptly in the archaeological record, they disappear. Unlike other bronze artifacts from the region, coins, weapons, decorative objects, the masks do not appear in large, well-documented assemblages. There is no clearly established typology, no widely recognized museum corpus, and no definitive sequence of finds that traces their development or decline. So what happened to them? From a mainstream archaeological perspective, several explanations are considered plausible. Bronze was a valuable and highly recyclable material in antiquity. Objects made of bronze were frequently melted down and repurposed, especially during periods of political instability or economic transition. In a region like Characene, where shifting control between Parthian and neighboring powers was not uncommon, the recycling of metal objects could easily account for their disappearance. Another explanation lies in preservation bias. The environmental conditions of southern Mesopotamia, high salinity, fluctuating groundwater levels, and long-term sediment deposition, are not ideal for the preservation of delicate metalwork. Unlike stone or ceramics, thin bronze artifacts are particularly vulnerable to corrosion and fragmentation over time. What survives archaeologically is often only a fraction of what once existed. Yet the absence of masks is not merely quantitative, it is conceptual. Even in sites where Caracene influence is evident, such as coin hoards or trade-linked settlements, there is a surprising lack of consistent artistic parallels to clearly identified bronze face coverings. This has led some researchers to question whether the masks were truly widespread cultural objects, or whether they belonged to a narrower, more specialized context that has not yet been fully understood. Could they have been restricted to specific ritual functions within elite circles? One interpretation suggests that the masks may have been used in ceremonial performances or funerary rites tied to rulership or priesthood. In this view, they would not have been everyday objects, but highly controlled symbolic items, used only under specific conditions and possibly destroyed or buried after use. Another possibility is that they were part of a hybrid artistic tradition influenced by multiple cultures intersecting in Caracene, Greek, Mesopotamian, and Arabian, resulting in artifacts that do not fit neatly into established typologies and therefore remain under-identified in archaeological classification. But more speculative interpretations also circulate at the edges of scholarship. Some researchers have proposed that the masks may have been intentionally removed from circulation or hidden due to changes in religious or political ideology. As belief systems evolved across the region, objects associated with older symbolic frameworks could have been decommissioned, destroyed, or repurposed in ways that erased their original identity. Others suggest that the masks may still exist but are misclassified within broader categories of bronze artifacts. Without clear inscriptions or contextual markers, fragmented metal faces could easily be interpreted as decorative fragments, shield fittings, or architectural ornaments rather than standalone ritual objects. There are even more uncertain theories that propose the masks were never intended to survive beyond their original use. In such interpretations, they may have functioned as temporary ritual interfaces, objects created for specific events and then deliberately dismantled or dissolved as part of ceremonial closure practices. And yet, despite these possibilities, the archaeological silence remains striking. No major excavation has yet produced a definitive collection of Caracene bronze masks. No widely recognized museum grouping confirms their existence as a standardized artifact type. What remains is a pattern of suggestion rather than certainty, references without continuity, descriptions without preservation, and cultural traces without material stability. So the mystery persists not because of what is present, but because of what is absent. Were the bronze masks of Characene once a meaningful but narrowly used ritual object type, lost through recycling, corrosion, and historical disruption? Or do they represent a misinterpreted fragment of a broader artistic tradition that has yet to be correctly identified within the archaeological record? And as the marshlands of the ancient delta shift slowly beneath modern landscapes, one final question lingers quietly in the metal and memory of a vanished kingdom. How many other cultural objects have already disappeared not through dramatic loss, but through the quiet erasure of time, material, and meaning? If the vanished bronze masks of Characene remind us that even crafted identity can dissolve through time, recycling, and silence, then the narrative now moves eastward again, away from the river deltas of Mesopotamia and into the dry, folded mountains of ancient Persia, where water itself was once drawn through darkness. Across the arid landscapes of central and eastern Iran lies one of humanity's most remarkable engineering traditions, the Qanat system. Known locally as Qarqan, these underground channels were designed to transport water from distant aquifers to settlements across vast desert regions. Some of these systems date back more than 2 millennia, with continuous use in various forms extending into the present day. Carved deep beneath the earth, the Qarqan tunnels are not natural caves but carefully engineered passageways, sloping, narrow, and extending for kilometers beneath barren terrain. At intervals, vertical shafts rise to the surface, allowing access for maintenance and ventilation. These structures represent a silent infrastructure of survival, hidden entirely from the surface world. Yet within certain lesser-studied sections of these subterranean networks, particularly in older, partially abandoned branches, there are reports of carved markings that do not appear to belong to the functional engineering system itself. These are the so-called unidentified symbols of the Qarqan caves. Unlike the standardized markings used by Qanat workers to measure slope, water flow, or structural boundaries, these symbols are described as irregular, clustered inscriptions found on tunnel walls in isolated chambers or widened recesses. Some are geometric, interlocking lines, concentric shapes, or angular patterns. Others appear more abstract, resembling sequences of marks that do not correspond to known Persian scripts from Achaemenid, Parthian, or later Sasanian periods. Mainstream archaeological interpretation approaches these findings cautiously. Qarqan systems were built, expanded, and repaired over many centuries by different groups of workers. In such environments, it is not unusual to find layered markings, some functional, some informal, and some added long after the original construction. It is possible that what appears as unidentified symbols may in fact be informal worker marks, ownership indicators, or later graffiti from individuals using or maintaining the tunnels across different historical periods. Environmental factors also complicate interpretation. The interior surfaces of Qanat tunnels are subject to constant moisture fluctuations, mineral deposition, and erosion. Over time, these processes can distort carved markings, softening lines or merging distinct symbols into ambiguous forms. What may have originally been simple administrative or technical notation could now appear abstract or indecipherable due to centuries of geological transformation. And yet, some aspects of the reported symbols resist simple categorization. In certain documented cases, the markings appear in locations far from any obvious structural necessity, small side chambers or widened spaces where water flow is minimal or absent. In other instances, symbols appear grouped in repeated sequences, as if following a pattern or structure that is not immediately tied to engineering function. So, What were they for? One interpretation suggests that these markings may have served as ritual or protective inscriptions. In many ancient cultures, underground spaces, especially those associated with water, were often considered liminal zones, connecting surface life with hidden sources beneath the earth. In such contexts, symbolic markings could have been placed to invoke protection, ensure water purity, or mark sacred points along subterranean routes. Another explanation remains strictly functional. The Qarqan system required complex coordination between multiple workers over long distances. Symbols could have functioned as a communication system, indicating maintenance status, structural risks, or directional guidance in sections where natural light never penetrates. Over time, as knowledge of these systems changed hands, the meaning of such markings could have been lost. But there are also more interpretive and speculative perspectives. Some researchers suggest that the symbols may represent remnants of an older, pre-Iranian cultural layer that predates later standardized writing systems in the region. If Qanat construction built upon earlier subterranean activity or reused existing underground spaces, it is possible that older markings were incorporated into newer systems without full understanding of their origin. In this view, the Qarqan tunnels are not just engineering works, but layered archives, where different generations inscribed their presence without fully erasing what came before. Other fringe interpretations propose that certain tunnel chambers may have served dual purposes: functional water transport combined with restricted access spaces used for gatherings, instruction, or specialized knowledge transmission. The symbols, in this case, could represent a form of coded or mnemonic system used within closed groups responsible for maintaining the most critical sections of the water network. However, no consensus supports any single interpretation. Part of the challenge lies in access. Many older Qarqan systems remain partially collapsed, flooded, or too narrow for systematic excavation. Modern surveys often rely on limited entry points, remote sensing, or historical documentation rather than full physical exploration. As a result, only fragments of the system and fragments of its markings are visible to study. This fragmentation shapes interpretation itself. Without a complete map of the tunnels, it becomes difficult to determine whether the symbols are widespread anomalies, localized phenomena, or artifacts of a specific construction phase. What appears mysterious in one section may have a clear counterpart elsewhere that has not yet been discovered. And yet, the sense of mystery persists precisely because these markings exist in a space that was never meant to be seen in the same way as surface architecture. Qarqan tunnels are hidden by design. Their purpose is function, not display. And yet, within that hidden world, someone, or something, left behind symbols that break the expectation of pure utility. So the question remains open, suspended in darkness beneath the desert floor. Were the unidentified symbols of the Qarqan caves simply practical marks that time has distorted beyond recognition? Or do they hint at a deeper cultural layer embedded within Iran's subterranean water systems, one where engineering, belief, and communication overlapped in ways that are now only partially visible? And as water continues to flow silently through some of these ancient channels even today, one final question lingers beneath the earth itself. How much of what we call infrastructure in the ancient world was also a form of language that we have not yet learned how to read? If the unseen markings inside the Qarqan tunnels suggest that even underground infrastructure can hold forgotten layers of meaning, then the narrative now shifts upward again, back into the open air, where stone once rose to defend desert roads, and then fell into an unexpected stillness that history never fully explained. On the edge of the basalt desert in eastern Jordan stands the remote Roman-era structure known as Qasr Bashir. Built in the early centuries AD during the Roman presence in the region, This desert fort is often described as one of the best preserved examples of Roman military architecture in Arabia. Its square walls, corner towers, and central courtyard reflect a standardized imperial design intended to project control across vast, sparsely populated frontier zones. From a distance, Qasr Bashir appears almost complete, its pale stone walls still rising cleanly from the desert floor, as if the garrison might return at any moment. But this visual impression is deceptive. Step closer, and the absence becomes more noticeable than the structure itself. There are no signs of prolonged occupation, no dense layers of habitation debris, no clear evidence of sustained military life beyond its initial construction and limited use. And this is where one of the quiet mysteries begins. Unlike other Roman frontier forts, which often show extensive adaptation over time, repurposed rooms, layered rebuilding phases, or evidence of civilian settlement, Qasr Bashir seems to have entered a kind of historical pause. It was built with precision, aligned with Roman logistical standards, and then largely left behind. So why would an empire known for its disciplined military infrastructure construct a fort that appears to have had such limited functional lifespan? Mainstream archaeological interpretations offer several grounded explanations. One widely accepted view is that Qasr Bashir was part of a broader network of temporary or auxiliary installations designed to secure specific routes or support short-term military campaigns. In this context, the fort may not have been intended as a permanent garrison, but rather as a strategic waypoint, constructed rapidly during a period of heightened frontier activity and then abandoned once the strategic need diminished. Another explanation points to shifting geopolitical realities. The Roman Empire's eastern frontier was not static. Control over desert trade routes and tribal alliances fluctuated over time. If regional stability improved, or if military priorities shifted elsewhere, the need for a permanent presence at Qasr Bashir may have quickly diminished, leaving the structure effectively obsolete soon after completion. Environmental factors also cannot be dismissed. Life in desert forts was logistically demanding. Water access, supply chains, and communication lines all had to be carefully maintained. If any of these systems failed or became inefficient, even a well-constructed fort could be rapidly decommissioned in favor of more sustainable positions. And yet, even with these explanations, Qasr Bashir retains a quality that invites further questioning. The structure is unusually intact for a site with such limited occupation history. Its preservation suggests either rapid abandonment under controlled conditions or a lack of subsequent reuse that would typically leave clearer archaeological traces of adaptation or decay through continuous human activity. So, what exactly does its silence represent? Some researchers suggest that Qasr Bashir may have functioned as part of a broader experimental phase in Roman frontier logistics, a network of forts tested in different configurations to evaluate their effectiveness in desert environments. In this interpretation, certain installations may have been deliberately decommissioned once their strategic value was assessed, leaving behind structures that appear abandoned, but were actually part of a planned cycle of use and closure. Others propose a more nuanced administrative explanation. The Roman military system was highly adaptable, and not all forts were continuously occupied. Some may have been maintained in a state of readiness without permanent garrisons, activated only during specific campaigns or seasonal movements. In such cases, the absence of occupation layers would not indicate mystery, but rather intermittent use that leaves minimal archaeological footprint. But there are also interpretive gaps that resist easy closure. Why does Qasr Bashir lack the kind of secondary reuse often seen in nearby Roman or post-Roman sites? Many forts in the region were later repurposed by local populations, transformed into agricultural enclosures, small settlements, or storage spaces. Qasr Bashir, by contrast, appears to have been largely left untouched. This has led some scholars to consider the possibility that its location was intentionally avoided after its initial phase of use. Whether due to strategic irrelevance, environmental discomfort, or shifting trade routes, the site may have simply fallen outside the evolving patterns of human movement across the desert. Still, alternative interpretations continue to surface at the margins of discussion. Some suggest that Qasr-Bshir may have held a symbolic or administrative role rather than a purely military one, functioning as a territorial marker or signaling structure rather than a heavily populated fort. In this view, its apparent emptiness would not be abandonment, but alignment with a different kind of imperial expression, presence without permanence. Others speculate that the fort may have been part of a larger network whose full extent has not yet been archaeologically mapped. If Qasr-Bshir was only one node in a wider system of communication or control, its isolated preservation might reflect incomplete understanding of the broader infrastructure to which it belonged. And yet, no additional connected sites have been definitively identified in a way that confirms this hypothesis. What remains instead is a structure that feels suspended in time, built with precision, positioned with intention, and then left without the layers of life that usually anchor architecture to history. So the silence becomes its defining feature. Not the silence of destruction, not the silence of collapse, but something more ambiguous, the silence of non-continuation. And as the desert wind moves across the empty courtyard, passing through stone corridors that once framed Roman military geometry, a final question lingers in the stillness. Was Qasr-Bshir simply a short-lived experiment in frontier control that outlived its usefulness almost as soon as it was built? Or does its sudden silence hint at a broader pattern of ancient infrastructure that was never meant to endure, only to appear briefly before being withdrawn from the landscape of history? If the sudden silence of Qasr-Bshir suggests that even carefully constructed places of power can fade without leaving a clear human trace, then the narrative now shifts far north and east, away from Roman frontiers and desert forts, into the vast steppe landscapes where burial itself was once an architecture of meaning. Across the grasslands, stretching between the Black Sea and the Caspian, ancient nomadic cultures shaped the earth into vast burial mounds known as kurgans. Among them were the early Sarmatians, a confederation of Iranian-speaking steppe peoples who flourished between roughly the 5th century BC and the 4th century AD. Their world was mobile, shaped by horse culture, seasonal movement, and complex networks of trade and conflict that connected them to both the Greek world and the broader Eurasian interior. Within this landscape of earth and horizon lies one of archaeology's quieter enigmas, an empty tomb discovered beneath an early Sarmatian burial mound. At first glance, the mound itself was unremarkable for the region. Like many kurgans, it rose gently from the steppe, a deliberate elevation of earth marking the resting place of an individual or group of high status. Such mounds often contained wooden chambers, stone-lined graves, or richly furnished burial spaces filled with weapons, ornaments, and offerings intended to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. But when archaeologists carefully excavated this particular mound, they found something unexpected: a burial chamber, constructed with evident care, aligned with the traditions of the period, and clearly intended to serve a funerary function, yet entirely empty. No human remains, no grave goods, no clear evidence of looting disturbance, just an architectural void where a burial should have been. So what does it mean when a tomb is built, sealed, and then found without its occupant? Mainstream archaeological interpretation begins with caution. The first possibility is disturbance over time. Steppe kurgans are highly vulnerable to natural processes, soil shifting, water infiltration, and the collapse of organic structures. If a burial chamber contained perishable remains, such as wooden coffins or textiles, it is possible that biological decomposition over centuries left little trace. However, even in such cases, associated artifacts or soil chemistry changes are typically present, and in many documented Sarmatian burials, such traces are clearly identifiable. In this case, the absence is more absolute than expected. Another explanation considers looting, a common occurrence in ancient burial sites. Grave robbing was widespread across Eurasian steppe cultures, both in antiquity and later periods. Yet looted tombs usually show clear signs of disturbance: broken structures, displaced stones, scattered fragments of remaining goods. The empty tomb in question reportedly lacked these indicators, suggesting a different kind of absence. The chamber appeared not to have been emptied. It appeared never to have been filled. This detail is what makes the discovery so unusual. Some researchers propose that the structure may have been a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb constructed for an individual whose body was never recovered or interred at the site. In many ancient cultures, cenotaphs served as ritual focal points for mourning, ancestor veneration, or political legitimacy, especially when death occurred far from home or under uncertain circumstances. If this interpretation is correct, then the emptiness of the chamber is not an anomaly, but the entire purpose of its construction. Yet questions remain. Why was such a carefully constructed burial mound created for a figure whose remains were absent? And why was there no accompanying inscription or marker clarifying its symbolic nature, as is sometimes found in other steppe funerary traditions? Some scholars suggest that the lack of clear markers may reflect the limitations of survival rather than original absence. Organic or perishable inscriptions could have existed on materials that did not endure, leaving only the architectural shell of the tomb behind. But there is another layer of uncertainty. The internal construction of the chamber suggests intention toward interment rather than symbolism. The spatial organization, placement of stones, orientation of the chamber, and structural reinforcement aligns closely with known burial practices intended to house physical remains and accompanying objects. This has led some archaeologists to question whether the emptiness reflects not intention, but interruption. Could the burial have been prepared but never completed? Steppe societies were often shaped by mobility, conflict, and rapid shifts in social structure. A burial could be planned during one season and disrupted by migration, warfare, or political change before completion. In such a scenario, the tomb would remain physically prepared but never occupied. Yet even this explanation leaves interpretive gaps. If the burial was interrupted, why was the structure still sealed? And why was there no secondary reuse or later disturbance, which is common in abandoned kurgans across the region? These unanswered details have led some researchers to explore more interpretive possibilities. One suggestion is that the tomb may have functioned as part of a ritual system where emptiness itself held meaning. In certain Indo-Iranian and steppe-related belief frameworks, symbolic absence can carry significance equal to physical presence, representing transition, spiritual journeying, or the liminal state between life and death. In this view, the empty tomb would not be a failure of burial, but a deliberate expression of belief. More speculative interpretations extend this idea further. Some propose that the tomb may reflect a moment of cultural transition, where older funerary practices were being replaced or reinterpreted, leaving hybrid forms that do not fully conform to later archaeological expectations. Others suggest that the mound could have been part of a broader ritual landscape, where not all constructed tombs were intended for permanent use, but instead functioned as temporary ceremonial structures. There are even broader theories that situate the phenomenon within patterns of steppe archaeology, where symbolic architecture occasionally precedes or outlasts its intended social function, creating structures that outlive the practices they were meant to support. And yet, despite these possibilities, no definitive conclusion has emerged. the empty tomb remains exactly what it appears to be: a carefully constructed burial space without its expected contents. Not destroyed, not clearly looted, not fully explained. So the silence within the mound becomes its most striking feature. In a landscape where burial mounds typically preserve echoes of identity, objects, bones, inscriptions, or ritual traces, this one preserves only structure and absence. And as the wind moves across the open steppe today, passing over countless other kurgans that still hold their secrets beneath the grass, a final question lingers quietly in the earth. Was this empty tomb the result of interruption, loss, or erosion? Or does it represent a deliberate form of remembrance in which absence itself was meant to speak louder than presence ever could?